everybody. So I want to start with a little story about when I was just beginning graduate school in clinical psychology, and I was just about to see my second client ever. And what's going through your mind is, when you're doing an intake interview at this point in your training, is you're thinking, oh my God, this person needs some serious help. And then you realize, oh my God, I'm the person who has to help them. And so that's kind of the mindset I'm in at this particular point in time. And so I go into my intake and take a deep breath. And this beautiful young woman comes in. She starts very articulate, intelligent. And I'm thinking, boy, I really hope, I'll do a good job and I can help this person. And so during an intake, you typically start with a very open-ended question. And that's what I did. I said, what brings you here? And her answer left me dumbstruck. She said, I don't have any joy in my life. And I was like, I don't remember anything in my clinical training about, joy deficit disorder. I'm looking through the DSM. Is it depression? No, doesn't meet the criteria for depression. Is it anxiety? No, nothing meets the criteria for an anxiety. Is it another mood disorder? I was really in a difficult spot. So I began to think about, how can I help this person in therapy? So I went back to my clinical supervisor and I said, what do I do for somebody who lacks joy in their life? And again, I was dumbstruck. He said, you know what? I don't know. Maybe you should go to the research literature. So I went to the research literature, and what I found was that there was really nothing there that was of much clinical relevance, very little research at all, as a matter of fact. And so I thought, well, I'll do the best I can. I'll try to listen very well to my client, help her find what will bring her some joy. But the good news is, I have a dissertation topic because, nobody apparently is doing much research here, and I could innovate, some new ground. So I thought, I'm going to study joy. Well, when you're at cocktail parties in graduate school or you run into your professors, everybody asks you, what are you going to study for your dissertation? And I would say joy, boisterously, And I was always disappointed to get these reactions like, joy? Like, are you serious? You're going to study joy? And I started to think, uh-oh, maybe people are sort of fallaciously generalizing from the lightness of my subject matter that, I might not be serious about my research. And I was really concerned about that. And so one day, I'm walking down the halls of Duquesne, where I did my doctorate, and as I'm walking down the hall, one of my professors, Paul Richer, is down the hall, and he says, hey, Brent. And I said, what? And he said, did you see the New York Times? And I said, no, I haven't seen the New York Times. He says, Marty Seligman's in the New York Times. And I said, who's Marty Seligman? And he said, he is the president of the American Psychological, he's still shouting, he's the president of the American Psychological Association. And I said, oh. And he said researchers need to study more joy in psychology. And I was like, finally, recognition. So I thought, good, I'm legit. People will I might be able to get a grant. And I began to pursue this dissertation topic. Now, I started off, because there was very little research out there, I started, examining what I could find in the research. But fortunately, Marty Seligman had a big impact on the field because he began to introduce this concept of positive psychology. And there's really three pillars of positive psychology. One, which would be my area, studying positive states like joy, like life satisfaction, like subjective well-being, but also positive traits, positive personality traits like courage or resiliency, but also what kinds of institutions help to foster these states and traits, what kinds of schools, what kinds of psychotherapies, what kinds of medicine. And so I thought, as I began to think about this, I was also thinking about the connections between these things. But first, I needed to start at a very basic level. I needed to know, what is joy? What do people mean when they use the word joy? When my client came in, what was she talking about when she said joy? And so I began to do interviews with people, and as I was doing interviews with people, I saw themes emerging out of the literature, and one of them was the sense of being centered or balanced in one's life. Another one was this warm, powerful, energized feeling moving upward and outward from the body towards the world. Also a feeling of connection to others. And all of these were very fascinating to me for various reasons. But this feeling of connection to others I thought was interesting, because what I had found in the literature was some research that showed that there's a connection between happiness and extroversion. And I thought, well, that was kind of a bummer because I'm a little bit of an introvert. But I also found that that made some sense based on what I was seeing here, that when people are socially engaged and socially connected, like extroverts are tended to do because they're more outgoing and more outwardly focused, they have more opportunities for joy. So thinking about this, I started to think about what might be some challenges that people would face who can't connect to other people. And then that brought me back to my client who was having a difficult time finding joy. And when you look at people who are more socially engaged over the course of a day, it turns out that they're happier when they have more socially engaged encounters. Also, when people have a larger social support network, quantitatively and more qualitative, better relationships, they have higher positive emotions, they have higher life satisfaction, they also tend to have less negative emotions. So that got me thinking about another concept that I'd come across in the literature that was very unrelated to joy at first. And the concept is called alexithymia. And the way to think about alexithymia is it's kind of an emotion blindness. The person really lacks insight into their own emotions. They have difficulty processing and experiencing their emotions. They have a hard time putting their emotions into words and identifying them. They have a difficult time describing their feelings, and they tend to try to keep their thoughts and their emotions at a relatively shallow level. They tend to avoid their experience of emotion. They stay away from it because it's threatening. Now, an interesting thing about alexithymia is when people score high, when they have difficulty processing emotions, when they score high in alexithymia, they also tend to score low in empathy. So there's interesting connection between somebody who has an emotion blindness and somebody who has a kind of empathy blindness. So when people score high in alexithymia, they tend to score lower on a measure of empathy called the interpersonal reactivity index. To sort of illustrate a kind of empathy blindness, think of somebody who's along the autistic spectrum. They tend to be high in both alexithymia and also they have very severe problems with empathy. And so to illustrate this, one of my clients, when I was doing work in group homes with young men with autism, one of my clients was this big guy. He was about 6 foot tall, about 250 pounds, and he would stand on one side of the table to do his behavior plan to set up the dinner table. And when he would do that, he would set down all the settings of the table, but they would all be facing him. Every dinner table set was facing him, and so I had to train him to stand in front of each chair and set up the dinner place, from that perspective. Otherwise, he just couldn't do it, right? So now, most people who have problems with empathy aren't that extreme, but it involves this difficulty putting yourself in the perspective of the other. Well, if you lack insight, if you have alexithymia and you lack insight into your own emotions, you're going to have difficulty identifying and understanding the emotions and perspectives of others. It makes logical sense. There's also differences in the way people process emotional information in the brain. You can use a research paradigm where you can show people pictures of other people in pain and then compare them to people who aren't in pain. And then researchers have taken this, and they can see that people who are alexithymic process these painful pictures in ways that are different from people who don't score high in alexithymia. So in this study by Moriguchi and colleagues, they did a comparison of those with alexithymia and those who weren't alexithymic using functional magnetic resonance imaging. And what that does is it tracks blood flow in the brain, so you can see what parts of the brain are becoming active. And you can see that the alexithymic group showed less cerebral activity in the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the dorsal pons, and the cerebellum. And they showed higher activity in the anterior insula, the posterior insula, and the inferior frontal gyrus. So what does all that mean? Well, the upshot of all this is that people who have low levels of empathy and who are alexithymic, this seems to be the result of a problem of self-awareness. And the problem of self-awareness seems to be linked to this difficulty between being able to take lower processing of emotion at a lower unconscious implicit level and articulating it in words and thoughts. One of the consequences of alexithymia is impaired affective forecasting. One way to think about this is, when you're thinking about what choices you want to make or what values you should hold in order to establish goals for yourself, you can forecast, if you're a good forecaster, you're going to make good decisions. You're going to say, this particular decision is going to make me happy, and this particular decision is going to make me unhappy, so I'm going to choose this route. But if you lack insight into your own emotions, then it impairs your ability to forecast the future and therefore to choose better values. So one of the consequences of this is that people who have alexithymia tend to make poor choices. They tend to make bad bets about what's going to make them happy. A good example of this is materialistic values. Now, as it turns out, people that are high in alexithymia also tend to score high on measures of materialistic values. They tend to value things and consumerism, say, more than they value people and connections with people. There's a variety of consequences that follow from this. People that are high in materialistic values have more negative emotions, envy in particular. They have higher levels of personal distress compared to other people. And as a result, they have more incidences of mental illness like depression and anxiety. They have higher rates of neuroticism, which is really a kind of emotional instability. And they're more narcissistic. They're more self-centered. Again, challenges with empathy. They also show deficits in positive traits and states. So they're lower in subjective well-being. They're lower in self-actualization, as well as vitality and global functioning. And it takes a hit on their personality traits as well. They tend to be less autonomous, less competent. They have lower meaning in life, lower self-esteem, and lower trait gratitude. So somebody who chooses materialistic values, that tends to be correlated with somebody who seems to have difficulty processing their emotions, and they're not really making good choices that will make them happier. So to explore this concept, we looked at the relationship between material values and negative indicators of well-being, and we wanted to see if alexithymia mediated that relationship. So we did a study of 104 undergraduate students, and we had them take these three measures: the material values scale, the Toronto alexithymia scale, and the ISANC personality scale. And what we found, just like the literature had shown, is that people who are high in materialistic values tended to be higher both in alexithymia and neuroticism, and those with alexithymia were also higher in neuroticism. And we looked at using a Sobel test, and we found that alexithymia did mediate that relationship between material values and neuroticism. So the conclusion from this is that when people persist in material values and become unhappy, this seems to be linked to a lack of insight into their own emotions and the emotions of others. In other words, it's a problem of affective forecasting. So there's hope, however, because research on mindfulness has shown that when you can train people to do the exact opposite of what alexithymic people do, you can train them to be more aware of their experiences and less avoidant of their experiences, and to engage in a more acceptance of their emotional states in order to gain knowledge and wisdom from those emotional states. As a result, this tends to deepen compassion for self and others. It tends to promote higher and more frequent experiences of joy. It lowers incidences of psychopathology and distress, and it also is linked to reduced endorsement of material values. And finally, it enhances relationships. And the more people enhance the relationships, the more socially engaged they are, the more frequent they're going to be able to experience profound experiences of joy. So I think I have an answer to my first client, but it took me a while to get around to it. Thank you very much.